But just looking at some of the questions that came in, some very interesting things, obviously. Mustafa, a lot of interest around modular building in terms of, I suppose, the way forward between a prescriptive method of testing and the ad hoc method, because we're in this new gray area of bringing in these technologies. Do you see it in the short term needing a prescriptive approach, or what do you think will happen short term?
A couple of things. I think what I've tried to point out during the talk was we still do need those traditional fire test evidence, but we would need additional fire test data just to convince us that they are suitable for the certain type and the configuration that we need for those modular constructions. Yeah. I think it would be very useful to have a best practice design guide in place, so everyone would follow the same rules and procedure. While I do understand different bodies in different countries, there are research going on at the moment to see how those concerns might be accepted or could be addressed. But having a best practice design guide in place, it would be a massive help for everyone who are dealing with regard to the fire safety aspect of these type of new method of constructions, I would say.
Yeah. Now, before I move on to another member of the panel, just Ian Richards has a very good observation when he asks, the workmanship can be inspected during the build and as part of the sign-off. Sure, that these are very technical builds, technical and new, I suppose. And he wonders, is it your opinion that only approved contractors should be allowed to work in these buildings after occupation? And I think what he's getting at there is, when you look at the construction industry as a whole right now, we've got 40 odd years of experience, 30 odd years of experience in compartmentation. When you come into a modular build like this, should the contractors in modular builds have already been pre-approved when running cables or putting in pipework and things?
This is one of the points that I think is a very good observation. I have to say, this was the point that we discussed it within a couple of discussions that we had. Like normal construction, if you are going to amend, add, or remove anything from the system, that system should again be assessed just to make sure that the system is still as a whole is going to be in compliance. Because you cannot start penetrating through a walled system which was giving you, for instance, about 90 minutes and expect to get the same performance. So any modification to the system or any addition or removal of the system which hasn't been discussed or reviewed at the time of construction, again, it has to be reviewed just to ensure that the system is going to follow up with the same, and basically is going to perform as it's intended. Because the last thing that you want is that you create a penetration into a wall, which is going to run between the two modules, and suddenly you would have a fire in one of the compartments, and that becomes the weak point and allows the flame to go between the modules at that point. And that would become a risk, not only from the spread of the flame point of view, but also from a structural point of view, especially if you are talking about high-rise constructions, which is in a hybrid format.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very interesting point. Abhishek, just a very quick one from you, from Kenneth Wong, I think at MADA. And this is a very general question, I suppose, but what are the testing needed for drywall facades? And can you tell us a little bit more about the NFPA test?
Sure. So the underlying theme across 4 or 5 categories which are defined in the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code for a facade application is this kind of 3-prong approach. The civil defense needs assurance and certainty that the components, materials, which could be, for example, if you're talking for drywall, whatever is there in the drywall, the product, insulation, material, etc., they all live up to certain reaction to fire requirements, like class A1 or A2 or B, depending on what is the type of occupancy it is allowed at. So one, it needs to establish by certification and listing that what is the reaction to fire properties. And then as a product manufacturer, the mandate on the product manufacturer is to come up with at least some evidence that in any given defined cladding mock-up design, a large-scale fire test is okay. It could be an NFPA 285, It could be the BS 8414 or the FM or ISO standards. But this is where a very interesting things come in, that the liability of the manufacturer is still this place. The manufacturer needs to give us some evidence. It could be any system. And that's where the handover of the liability goes to the contractor or the designer who is procuring the material from the material manufacturer and saying, hey, you have a given evidence of a large scale fire test, but my project is different. It does not align. And the fire consultant or somebody needs to come in and say, wait a minute, we need additional evidence, which is what, kind of Mostafa was also mentioning, that, when the system is different, then a different compliance requirements are needed. And this is quite a to and fro between the contractor and the material supplier, that who pays for it, and it's always demand and supply. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers that question, Ed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm trying to spread out these questions with our three panelists. I don't want to leave anybody out. David, coming to you, and I think this question answers itself really. It comes from Martin Keeley. Is the installer approval scheme mandatory anywhere that you know of? And then obviously, if not, I assume it's our responsibility to recommend it.
To my knowledge, it's not mandatory anywhere in the world. More's the pity. But yes, it is up to the specifier, the end user or the developer, to state that they want a company that is, say, LPS 1048 certificated for sprinklers in the UK. And that would be a driver for who can tender and what level of actual company within that scheme could tender.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going
back to the mod, sorry, what?
I think the UAE code, as well as some codes in the United States, mandate installer inspections as mandatory. There are some ASTM methods which are mandatory in the States, as well as here in the UAE code, where it is installation inspection is mandatory. NFPA 80 again for fire doors is something that is mandatory in the Saudi building code now. How it is going to be provided and checked is a different discussion, but yeah, the code calls for it.
No, absolutely. And as we know here, obviously, sprinkler installers and designers need to prove competency with civil defense by passing a test by them. But obviously, we know we live in a transient part of the world, and, a certificate or a testing of a personnel is only as good as long as that personnel is there. So I wonder, where does third-party certification of installers come into this, and is there a need for it even? There may or may not be. Going back to then modular building, and a question from Sajid Raza from Mostafa. Where is it there? Yeah. While providing consultancy, testing, and certification, who provides third-party inspections? Is there an accreditation requirement for such inspections for third parties? And he adds, keeping conflict of interest in mind. So yeah, I suppose, where's the third-party inspections coming from in these buildings?
There are a couple of companies who could deliver these type of site inspections. There are approved site inspectors that they can do those site inspections. But those are, I think David mentioned it on his presentation, that those people are the people who are trained for it, and they know the products, they know the end use of the products, and that's why they can do those inspections. So being just a site inspector is not enough. You should have experience, and you should make sure that you know the products when you want to do the site inspection. So in that sense, yes, there are site inspectors in place, but any site inspector can do that site inspection. The answer is no. They have to know the product, and they have to be familiar with those type of construction before they could come on site. Because from my perspective, experience is everything here. Because if you are experienced, you know where you have to look, you know where potentially something could go wrong, and this is the key here. Because if you want to avoid any poor workmanship in that area, because the approved installers, great, you have to have those ones in place, and they are related, and you would discuss it with manufacturers maybe as well. They're just saying that if they could recommend someone, but at the end of the day, if you want to site inspect as an independent person, those people should be independent and they should have a knowledge of the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's where experience comes into play. And while we're in this transition period, it's difficult to find people with that experience. So we have to navigate that quite delicately.
Yes.
I must add that, from a compliance point of view, there are very interesting ISO standards, 17 or 20 and 17 or 24, which kind of lay some guidelines on how to create parity between inspectors and validate that, yes, this inspector is still can undertake an inspection, is qualified for it, as well as the inspection body.
Yeah, absolutely. Abhishek, while you're there, and obviously your name, as you quite rightly pointed out, is in the UAE Fire Code. You've lined yourself up for this one. Now, just I some clarity, because I'm not actually sure, and I couldn't find it very quickly there in the Fire Code. But Vibor asks around fire extinguishers, and you may or may not know this off the top of your head, but the UAE Fire Code mentioned it as daily inspections and monthly inspections for the fire extinguishers. Do you have any clarity on that?
Well, active fire protection is something that I rarely focus on because that's not my area of expertise. But my guess is the gentleman can look into Chapter 18, and I am pretty sure that the responsibility and liability could be sitting either with the FM company or probably even the owner or the tenant, that they have to get someone to do this.
Yeah,
I believe so.
Kenneth Wong from MADA would also like more NFPA knowledge from you or information from you on your testing. So I suggest, Kenneth, that you drop Abby your business card and arrange a call with him to discuss that a little bit further. Where's this other question? Sorry, guys, I'm just digging through my questions here. Second, Terry Johnson has a good input there. He says, great presentation, Mostafa. While you provide consultancy testing and certification, oh no, sorry, that's the last question. Yeah, a great deal of good fire and life safety elements are being developed and in touch with dynamic developments and imaginative designs, as we see around us all the time now. However, as fire code standards, testing, certification are being updated and controlled, what are your thoughts, Mostafa, with the existing stock of which we now, where is that? Of which we now should consider as the code non-compliant buildings and often pose life safety threats? We should not leave these threats behind, but should really focus perhaps more on how we can make these buildings safer. So I suppose that's an interesting topic, in that, especially with recent events and in the news, that yes, we should look at new ways of building and how to make it safe, but what are your thoughts on looking backwards on existing stock of buildings and making them safe?
Well, there are, I think for the existing buildings, we already have the first thing that we have to make sure is that have they been constructed based on the regulation of the time? Because if they were not compliant even at the time, that's one of the problems. But going back for the existing constructions, if you want to make them safe, you have to look into the current knowledge that we have, the best of information that we currently have, and they start to build based on those ones. If we are using a new type of products which hasn't been used to make that building safer, or making any amendments, again, my point of approach would be that we have to go to those first principles of how we are going to address that risk, and that's the risk-based analysis that we have to do for the construction. We have to understand what the occupancy is, we have to understand what are the risks in place, how those risks would affect our designs, and based on having all those information, we start to plan how we are going to address them. As a part of that, I would suggest that we would review all the test evidence which have been used at the time to ensure that if there has been any changes in the code, just to make sure that if the result would still be compliant or not, because as we know, a couple of times the standards has changed and changed their pass and fail criteria. If that has been changed, then we need to make sure that that is not going to sit within that criteria. And then compiling all those informations and the information that we currently have, I think we should be able to improve to get the system to this stage that we could be fit for purpose. But there are a couple of cases, as we all know, that we may not improve. I mean, we may not be able to improve the system. At that point, we may need to do some refurbishments in that area just to make sure that it wouldn't cause any risk to anyone's life.
Yeah. Excellent. I see we're fast approaching our timeline. David, one final question from you from Bassam. I think more of a explanation or a clarification. You mentioned all types of installers except drywall installers and partitions as not being critical in parts of construction. I assume that you do think they're critical, just that they're not covered by your scope.
Well, they are covered by installer schemes, and we do have a passive team of installers. The main one that is obviously a focus for them is fire doors, etc. But yes, we do have fire boarding inspectors and things as well. It's just as important. If I was to cover all of the installer schemes that are out there, we probably would have used up all of the time that was allotted for the whole actual presentations. So no, I apologize if I didn't cover everybody, but all of the schemes are just as important as any others.
Yeah, that's excellent. With that, I'll invite Philip back to join us. Philip, if you're there. And to everyone watching, I'll encourage you to please join the networking section of the exhibition, and we can talk to the speakers more there one-on-one or in a group.